Let's speak with James Treadwell, Professor of Criminology, University of Staffordshire. James, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
It is always a difficult question, child murderers. Sadly, there have been many over the years. It's still a very small part of that overall crime, a small demographic of that overall crime who commit murder. But nonetheless, when it happens, it shocks us almost even more that a child, these kids were 12 when this was carried out, and of course they won't be tried as adults, they won't be sentenced as adults, although the age of criminal responsibility is younger than 12, as I understand it.
It is in England and Wales. The age of criminal responsibility is 10, it clearly, and many people will say at the age of 10, many do know the differences between right and wrong, and it is a horrendous offence. We can't escape that. I think overall we need to understand some of the picture of our prisons and what's going on as connected in some ways, and there are some good news stories in amongst that. One of those has been the falling level of youth crime in some ways. Young people, we're locking up fewer young people than we have done historically or traditionally. There is a second part to that picture, though, which is that when we are putting young people into prison custody, it is seemingly for very, very serious offences for an increasingly long time. So when we incarcerate young people today, it tends to be for more serious offences than historically. We're not talking about taking vehicles without the owner's consent or sort of shoplifting or thefts or burglaries. We are talking about very, very serious violent crimes which are attracting very, very lengthy custodial sentences, and the length of those custodial sentences for young people is increasing as well, and that's one of the reasons that sits behind a growing prison population. If you take young people who are in their teens and 20s and incarcerate them for 15, 20, in some cases 30 or more years, they're going to spend a very, very long time in prison custody. It's a smaller number that we're doing that with, but despite it being a smaller number, they're going to be in prison for a significant amount of time.
It would seem likely that they will get a mandatory juvenile life sentence out of this. I can't imagine any mitigation that would suggest otherwise. I mean, I'm sure there's a defence case of the background, the dysfunctionality of family life, lack of education, all of the things that a defence counsel would offer in a case, but it would seem likely that the judge will sentence these children, after all, to life, but it's a juvenile life sentence which differs from a non-juvenile life sentence. Is it 5 or 10 years the difference, or something of that order?
Yeah, when it comes to grave crimes that are committed by young people, there is some mitigation in that the sentences that are given, while they are still life sentences, do tend to be somewhat shorter, recognising that there is a degree of there is less maturation amongst young people, and particularly we've traditionally and historically kind of recognised that one of the contentious points, and this is where Thompson and Venables were interesting, one of the contentious points is moving particularly young people from the care of the state, as it were, and from local authorities into the care of the prison service. Yeah. Because imprisonment is very, very different to that happens previously. So particularly for children, we tend to pass somewhat lower custodial sentences, although again, even there, those sentences have been getting longer. Undoubtedly, I think with these young people, it's very, very likely that the length of sentence that they're going to get is going to mean that they're likely to spend some time in prison custody. There is a debate about whether or not that has a purpose, because our prisons at the moment are terrible, terrible places. They're lawless, they're violent, they're destructive. And I take the case of Thompson and Venables as very illustrative of this point. We know with John Venables, for example, that having been released from prison custody, he's behaved abysmally and has been returned to prison custody. Robert Thompson is slightly different, though, and the way that we deal with young people when we incarcerate them as young people is very much focused in the first instance on rehabilitation, on education, on trying to kind of deal with and address those problems that were likely there within them before we put them into an adult state, and seeing if we can get them to a stage where they're not going to reoffend again. Now, the problem is when we start to move young people into the prison estate because of how it is and what it's like, some of the good work that you can undo when they're very young through education, through dealing with the problems that they have, can be undone. And that's partly to do with the fact that our prisons run in a very, very different way from the local authority provision that they're likely to go into immediately.
What about and this isn't at the moment a thing in this country, I alluded to it though, James, at the beginning, of parental responsibility, and I was notably talking about a recent high court shooting in the States where the father of one of these kids has been charged with murder as well. He was the guy that supplied the gun, and therefore he's culpable in the eyes of that law. I'm not sure if that's a state law or a federal law, but nonetheless, he's been charged with pretty much the same offence. Forever, people have called for that in this country, that if you have, these two were 12 when they did this, I mean, you'd have to reasonably assume that there was something pretty grim going on in the upbringing or the backdrop of this, and without sounding too stereotypical, you can almost take a guess at the kind of upbringing these kids might have had. Is there an appetite to look at parental responsibility in this way in this country?
I think there is in some ways, and historically, again, the previous Labour government that came to power with Tony Blair in 1997 was very, very keen at looking at parental responsibility, and gave us things like parenting orders and so forth. And I think, for a lot of people, a lot of the listeners are going to think, well, yes, what makes 12-year-old boys, behave in that way, and you do often have to look into the backgrounds, and what you see is an awful lot of dysfunction. I mean, you can certainly see that in the case of Thompson and Venables and others. There's the case of Mary Bell if we go back even further. And very often, a well-functioning, well-raised 12-year-old is not going to go out and randomly attack someone with a machete. So, and we do have to kind of question what it is that takes young people to that point. I think once you do that as well, you start to recognise that young people are perhaps different to those adult offenders that we're putting in prison custody for murder, and different things can be done. And it is interesting to me that of those three cases mentioned, Bell, Thompson and Venables, that the rehabilitative interventions that we used that were very much kind of framed around their childhood and were about kind of educating and putting them back in the community under strict supervision did work in two cases and not in one other. And I think most people would rightly think, that at the age of 12, you're not the person that you potentially become at 18, 21, 25, and that's not solely down to the individual young person. So while I think people will accept these boys knew the difference between right and wrong, how they come to do something quite so hideous does need to be thought about, and does offer some degree of hope and mitigation. That now, of course, people there will be cases, there will be offenders where I think it's very, very right that our attitude is, if they're going to remain a risk to the public for the foreseeable future, perhaps for the rest of their lives. We see that with life without parole prisoners, people like Wayne Couzens, who murdered Sarah Everard, lock them up and throw away the key. But I think it would be very bad of us as a society in some ways to think that we can't take someone at the age of 12 and potentially do things that make that make a repeat of that behaviour very, very unlikely. And indeed, we've actually shown that previously and historically we have done that. Bell and Thompson do illustrate it, even if Venables doesn't. You know, so I think there is, particularly where youth is involved, there's perhaps a better message for rehabilitation. The question then perhaps becomes, how long does it take? And as I say, we've been increasing the length of time that we incarcerate quite young people for. You know, so sometimes life sentences for those who are 18, 19, 20, I've seen have been 25, 30 years. You know, that's a very, very long time. Now, it's very, very difficult to do the sort of rehabilitative work in our prisons because the environment that they are. Drug use, violence, run rampant. But when we take young boys who are 12 years old and we're putting them into local authority secure accommodation where the focus should be on their well-being, their education, potentially, you know, turning them out as you know, productive members of society, there is an argument that different things can be done there. And I think we need to understand that, you know, that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Indeed. James, very thorough stuff. Thank you. Really appreciate that. James Treadwell, Professor of Criminology, University of Staffordshire.